Hello, I'm Bridgette from the Lake County Public Library, and today's middle grade book tasting is Richard Peck's A Long Way from Chicago. We are able to share this book with the kind permission of Dial Books for Young Readers, a member of Penguin Putnam. It is a 1999 Newbery Honor book and has a Lexile of 750. The AR is 5 and it is worth 5 points. It's available in our system as an ebook, an e-audiobook, an audiobook, and a regular book as well. The book started out as a short story which became the first chapter. Richard Peck's story is about a brother and sister, Joey and Mary Alice, who are from Chicago and go to stay their summers with their Grandma Dowdle way out in rural Illinois. Grandma Dowdle is as tough as nails, quick-witted, and always seems to have a scheme to get justice served, even if that means stealing the sheriff's boat and illegally trapping fish to feed the hungry drifters that pass through town. Although Joey and Mary Alice are hesitant to stay with their grandma the first year, they soon realize that even though she puts them to work, the summers spent there are always interesting and there never seems to be a dull moment, despite being on the outskirts of a small country town. This book is fun and adventurous and for everyone with an odd family member. It is set during the Great Depression, so it gives some insight as to how hard that time was for everyone. Despite the lack of money, Joey, Mary Alice, and Grandma Dowdle are able to make great memories and have fun summers together. I'm going to read the second chapter called The Mouse in the Milk, and this is the summer of 1930. From something Dad said, it had dawned on Mary Alice and me that our trip down to Grandma's was meant to be an annual event. Mary Alice pitched a fit. It meant another week of summer vacation away from her friends, Beverly and Audrey. Besides, she wasn't over last year's visit. Yet, one night, she'd have a nightmare about old Shotgun Cheatham sitting up in his coffin, and on the night after that, she dreamed that Grandma's big old tomcat was jumping at her, or so she said. But having no choice, we went. If any of us had grown over the year, it was Grandma herself, and she still seemed to prize her privacy as much as ever. She mostly stayed home because she said the whole town was a slum, and she didn't give two hoots about it, and she wouldn't even have a radio in her house. Mary Alice brought her jump rope to keep herself occupied, although she said jumping rope by herself was the loneliest job in the world. I took a giant jigsaw puzzle to put together. It was supposed to depict Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh and his airplane, the Spirit of St. Louis. There wasn't room for it in our Chicago apartment, but in the summers, Grandma took down the stove that heated her front room, so there was a space to leave a card table up. One night, after we arrived, I was working on the puzzle, and Grandma was drowsing in her platform rocker. She said she never slept, but she had to wake herself up to go to bed. Earlier, before it got dark, Mary Alice had been jumping rope outside. There weren't a lot of sidewalks in Grandma's town, but a strip of concrete ran from her front door, out to the countrified mailbox beside the road. Grandma and I had been listening to Mary Alice. Jump, said Coolidge. Jump, said Hoover. Jump, said the driver of the furniture mover. And Mary Alice's personal favorite, I had a letter from Nellie, and what do you think it said? Nellie had a baby, and its hair was red. Now how many hairs were on that head? 1, 2, 3. When she got up to 180, Grandma called her inside. So now Mary Alice was sulking somewhere. Grandma's breathing was steady, the way it got before she started snoring. Then I heard a horse clopping past. That was no rare thing around here. But I noticed the silence when the horse stopped outside. Then, right away, heels kicked its sides, and the horse galloped off. It was a sound right out of a Tom Mix movie. I was reaching for a puzzle part that was just blue sky when a flash of light filled the bay window. Then an explosion shook the house and made my puzzle jump. It wasn't as loud as the time Grandma squeezed off 2 rounds right here in the front room, but it brought her out of her chair. Like a ship under sail, she made for the front door. Mary Alice appeared from somewhere, and we both looked around Grandma into the night. You could barely see a stump out by the road. It was the post that held the mailbox, but the mailbox was gone in several directions. We heard a piece of metal slide down the shingles of the roof, bounce off the gutter, and fall through the snowball bushes. Somebody on horseback had blown Grandma's mailbox sky high. The 4th of July was over, but there were still plenty of loose fireworks around, and this was no small charge, not a baby walker or even a torpedo. This could have been the work of a cherry bomb. Grandma planted her big fists on her big hips, and her jaw clenched in a familiar way. "Cowgills," she said, like that explained it. Grandma slept in a room downstairs to save herself the stairs. Mary Alice and I had room upstairs. They were sparsely furnished with iron bedsteads and a lot of dead bugs on the sills. After I got used to how quiet the country was at night, I slept good up there. But I lie awake that night, recalling the sound when Grandma's mailbox was blown into smithereens. I was 10, the age when things blown up interested me, but I wondered, who dare do this to Grandma? My eyelids drooped, and it was morning. The smell of breakfast wafted up from the kitchen. You had to be downstairs on time and in your place, but Grandma's breakfasts were worth it. Pancakes and corn syrup, fried ham and potatoes and onions, anything you wanted, and as much. Mary Alice and I were at the table, and Grandma was at the stove turning one last round of pancakes when we got a visitor on the back porch. We all looked. The screen on the door blurred her, but it was Grandma's old enemy, Mrs. Effie Wilcox. She didn't make free to rap on the door. She just stood out on the porch in a faded apron and broken boots, working her hands. "Mrs. Dowdle, wee!" she called out in a tragic voice. Grandma strolled over to the door. "What now?" she said through the screen wire. Mrs. Wilcox moaned. "First of all," she said, "can I use it?" She nodded down the back path to the cob house and the privy, and she didn't mean the cob house. "Feel free," Grandma said. "Take a pew." But Mrs. Wilcox just stood there on the porch, wringing her hands. "I'm so nervous, I don't know if—" "What's come over you?" Grandma said in her least interested voice. Mrs. Wilcox whimpered. "Send them kids out of your kitchen so I could tell you." "They're having their breakfast," Grandma said, "and they're from Chicago, so they've heard everything." "Well, it was last night," Mrs. Wilcox said. "They come on my place and wrenched up my you-know-what by the posts and flung it all over the yard." "They knocked over your privy 3 months ahead of Halloween?" Grandma was interested at least. "What's the world coming to?" "That's what I said," Mrs. Wilcox replied. "I'm too nervous to live. All the laws of civilization has broke down, and town life is getting too dangerous. My only consolation is that there's a prayer meeting at church tomorrow night, and I've got some praying to do." "Do that," Grandma said, but Mrs. Wilcox couldn't wait another minute. She darted off the porch and down the path to our privy. Grandma settled into her chair to smother her last pancake with corn syrup. Then, once again, she said, "Cowgirls." Presently, Mary Alice slipped down from her chair and headed outside. When she got to the screen door, Grandma said, "I wouldn't use the privy all morning if I were you." That next morning when I came into the kitchen, a sight stopped me dead in the door. Behind me, Mary Alice pulled up short too. Next to a box of shells, Grandpa Dowdle's old double-barreled Winchester Model 21 was on the kitchen table, along with a greasy rag, like Grandma meant to clean it. Just the sight of that gun made my ears ring. Then I saw somebody besides Grandma was in the kitchen over by the door. He was a big, tall galoot of a kid with narrow eyes. His gaze kept flitting to the shotgun. The uniform he had on was all white with a cap to match. In his hand was a wire holder for milk bottles. He was ready to make his escape, but Grandma was saying, "I hope I have better luck with your milk today than the last batch. I found a dead mouse in your delivery yesterday." The kid's narrow eyes widened. "Naw, you never," he said. "Be real careful about calling a customer a liar," she remarked. "I had to feed that milk to the cat, and the mouse too, of course." "Naw," the kid said, reaching around for the knob on the screen door behind him. Grandma was telling one of her whoppers. If she'd found a mouse in the milk, she'd have exploded like the mailbox. She was telling a whopper, and I wondered why. "And another thing," she said, "I won't be needing a delivery tomorrow, neither milk nor cream. I'm going away." First we'd heard of it, Mary Alice nudged me hard. "I'll be gone tonight and all day tomorrow, and I don't want the milk left out where it'll sour. I won't pay for it. I'm taking my grandkids on a visit to my cousin Leota Shrewsbury." Another whopper, a huge one. "Grandma off on a jaunt with us and her?" I didn't think so. She didn't do things that cost, and she never told anybody her business. Turning from the stove, she pretended surprise at seeing Mary Alice and me there, though she had eyes in the back of her head. "Why, there's my grandkids now." She pointed us out with a spatula. "They're from Chicago." "Gangs run that town, you know," she told the kid. "My grandson's in a gang, so you don't want to mess with him. He's meaner than he looks." I hung in the doorway, bug-eyed and short. She was saying I, Joey Dowdle, was a tough guy from Chicago, and this kid was twice my size. He could eat me for lunch. "This here's Ernie Cowgill," she said, finishing off the introductions. With a snare at me, Ernie Cowgill disappeared through the door and stomped off the porch. "Grandma," I croaked, "you'll get me killed." She waved that away. "I just said that for your protection. He'll be scared of you now. He'd believe anything. He's only in the 4th grade. "Grandma, he's at least 16. "That's right, and still in the 4th grade, she said. "He's the runt of the Cowgill litter. He's got 3 older brothers, and they're big bruisers. They're the ones you wouldn't want to meet up with in a dark alley." She swept shotgun shells and the greasy rag off the kitchen table and put them all back behind the wood box. Then she nodded at Mary Alice to set the table for breakfast. When we sat down to eat, I said, "Grandma, what was the shotgun for?" "Bait," she said. "Who's cousin Leota Shrewsbury?" Mary Alice asked. "Who?" Grandma said. "I lurked pretty near home all day. I didn't even go uptown to the Coffee Pot Cafe for fear I'd run into Ernie Cowgill and his brothers." Now I remembered where I'd heard the name. The horse-drawn milk wagon that delivered to the door had a sign on its side that said, "Cowgill's Dairy Farm. From our clover-fed cows to your kitchen. Strictly sanitary. Farm fresh eggs, our specialty." In fact, I'd seen Ernie driving it, standing up, handling the reins through a hole in the front window of the wagon. Even at a distance, he looked like somebody you wouldn't want to know better. It may have been just a coincidence that a family named Cowgill ran the dairy. I never knew. Noticing how close to home I was keeping, Grandma told me to weed the garden. You didn't want to hang around her too close, or she'd give you a job. The garden ran neat and tidy from the back porch down to the cob house beside the yard where she stretched her clothesline. I weeded through the heat of the day, and every time I got down by the cob house, I had a vision of all 4 Cowgill brothers stepping out of it. I could picture them hanging me by the eaves, by my belt, and taking turns slapping me to sleep. But I saw nothing but the cross paws of the old tomcat napping just inside the door. 2 rows of green onions made my eyes water, and the smell was making me woozy. I was thinking seriously of heat stroke when I heard Mary Alice shriek in the kitchen. She was no screamer, so it brought me to my feet. Now I thought Ernie Cowgill had gotten in and pounced on her. I jumped to the garden rows, pounding for the house, but it was only Grandma and Mary Alice in the kitchen. Mary Alice's eyes were as big as quarters, like Orphan Annie's, and she had both hands clapped over her mouth. Grandma towered over the table. Held high in her hand was a mouse trap with a mouse in it still. A good-sized mouse. Its tail dangled down so far it looked like one of the fly paper strips that hung in her kitchen ceiling. The spring on the trap had caught the mouse at the neck and nearly pulled his head loose. He was hanging by a thread. Not a pretty sight. Mary Alice had gone into shock. This was one more of those experiences she says gave her nightmares for years. Grandma examined her catch. Now she moved the trap into position over the mouth of an empty bottle. She eased up the spring and the mouse dropped straight in. He hit the bottom of the bottle with a soft bump. She turned back to the drain board and picked up another bottle full of fresh milk. I suppose from Ernie Cowgill's morning delivery. Without spilling a drop, she poured milk into the bottle on the table. Mary Alice and I watched like two paralyzed people as the milk rose around the mouse's furry gray body until his whiskers began to float. As the milk closed over his head, Mary Alice bolted. If the back door had been latched, she'd have gone straight through the screen wire. Now Grandma was fitting a paper lid over the milk and mouse bottle. I knew not to ask why she was doing this. I didn't even want to know. Mary Alice didn't come back in the house till supper time. Then she didn't want any supper. I watched her move green beans and fat back around the plate with a big fork in her small hand. Grandma ate hearty. After a big wedge of layer cake, she pulled back from the table. Let's step right along and get them dishes washed and dried up and put away, she said. She was in a hurry, and I couldn't see why, but then I couldn't see a moment ahead. There was still some evening left, but the light was fading. Grandma stayed in the kitchen after we wandered into the front room, but as Mary Alice was reaching for her jump rope to take outside, Grandma turned up and said, "Not tonight." Mary Alice glowered but said nothing. She flopped on the settee and fidgeted. Then she started to go upstairs. She'd brought a book called The Hidden Staircase by Caroline Keene, and she liked reading it in bed. "Not tonight," Grandma said. She sat at her ease in the platform rocker with her sewing basket at her feet. She didn't do much fancy needlework, but she mended everything. Mary Alice came to lean against me while I worked on Colonel Lindbergh. When it got so dark I couldn't see the puzzle, I reached to turn on the lamp, but Grandma said, "Not tonight." By then we had to know we were in for something. "Shut the front door," Grandma told Mary Alice, who was just a little gray shape, mouse-like, as she went over to close it. "And shoot the bolt across," said Grandma, who never locked her doors. Now we three were the only outlines in the dark parlor. Some plot was afoot. Mary Alice edged back on the settee. We were all waiting for something. It was dark now. I could picture what the house looked like from outside. Locked up, not a light showing upstairs or down. All of us gone away to visit Cousin Leota Shrewsbury, who didn't exist. Half an hour passed, then Grandma spoke, making us leap. "We could tell ghost stories," she said. "Not tonight," Mary Alice said in a small voice. Later, much later, we heard something. The snowball bushes outside the window swayed gently. I barely saw Grandma's hand come up to stroke her cheek. We didn't breathe for listening. The footsteps on the back porch creeping, then more confident. After all, nobody was home. A hand closed over the knob on the screen to the kitchen and found it latched. We heard a little singing sound as a file began to slice through the screen wire. From the settee, Mary Alice made some tiny, terrified sound. Grandma reached down for something in her sewing basket. The darkness made me see pinwheels like sparklers. I just managed to notice Grandma's rocker was rocking, and she wasn't in it. She was standing over me. "Just keep behind me," she whispered. I followed her across the room into the kitchen. You wouldn't believe a woman that heavy could be so light on her feet. She floated and we moved like some strange beast in a big front, small behind. Now we were by the door to the kitchen, and I heard the scuffle of heavy feet in there on the crinky linoleum. Grandma turned back to me. Under my nose, she struck a wooden match with her thumbnail. Men strike a match one-handed, but you've never seen a woman doing that. She hid the flare of the flame with herself and touched the match to something in her other hand. It sizzled. Then she leaned down and rolled it into the invisible kitchen. Seconds passed. Then once more, Grandma's house erupted in sound and light. Blue lightning flashed in the kitchen, and for a split second, you could see every calendar on the wall in there. Then an almighty explosion like the crack of doom. She'd rolled a cherry bomb across the floor, and it went off. Underneath the 8 feet of the Cowgill brothers, 3 big bruisers and Ernie. Grandma shoved me past her into the kitchen. Pull the chain on the ceiling light, she said, and I did. When I turned back to her, Grandpa Dowdle's shotgun was wedged into her shoulder. I dodged out of her way, and there stood all 4 Cowgill brothers. They were deaf as posts and too scared to move. Even before they realized, they were looking down both barrels of the gun they'd come to steal. All of them wore manure-caked steel-toe boots, so that had saved their toes from being blown off. But a single smell came from their pants. The cherry bomb had scared them witless, except for Ernie, who was witless anyway. But he was the only one who could speak. "I'm dead," he said. "I'm dead. Oh yes, I'm dead." So I'm going to stop there. But if you guys wanted to hear more about this book, feel free to check it out from us. And if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them at kids@lcplin.org. And I hope you guys have a good, happy rest of your day. Thanks. Bye-bye.